Hey there, Miss Lee again. Welcome back to Psychology. This is Unit 1, Scientific Inquiry, Section 2, A History of Psychology. So you may be wondering why we are talking about history in a psychology class. Well, it's important to know how far we've come so we know how far we can still go. So what we're going to be talking about in today's video is the historical background of psychology, how it started, how it evolved, how it became a science. So get ready. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and get your notes ready. So believe it or not, psychology has really been around for a long time. It has its roots in ancient Greece. And when you think way back to some of the philosophers like Socrates, Socrates believed that we can learn a lot about ourselves by examining how we think, how we feel, and he really came up with this idea called introspection, which is basically looking within. And how I remember that is intro, inside, introspection. So he's the one who really started thinking about thinking. Plato was one of his students, and he was the first one to come up with this idea of a psyche. And the psyche describes both the mind and the soul. And what he did was he developed a real basic idea and framework of why we behave the way that we do, our reasoning, our impulses, all of the things that make us us. He proposed that the human psyche was the seat of all knowledge, that it was really the most important thing, and that basically the human mind already had all of the knowledge that it needed. Learning was just a matter of unlocking that potential. Aristotle came a little bit later. He was a student of Plato, and his approach was much more scientific. He actually argued that behavior is subject to certain rules and laws, just like the other sciences. So he noticed that the planets moved in certain patterns, that the stars worked a certain way, and he argued that our behavior really follows certain patterns as well. He was the first one to come up with this idea of associationism, which is a learned connection between two ideas or events. So, for example, thoughts can lead to dreams, or seeing someone's face can lead you to feel more calm, or the smell of fresh baked cookies can lead you to think about a really wonderful childhood memory. So that's associationism, and it's basically associating one thing with another. So as time progressed, we got into the Middle Ages, and mostly what happened in that period of time was that people believed that mental health problems were somehow religiously based. So they often thought that it was something to do with possession by demons, and it could be that they were being punished for some type of sin. Psychology continued to develop over time, and during the scientific revolution of the 15 and 1600s, you had two major players that really emerged in this field. First, there was Francis Bacon. He was the one who developed that scientific method that I'm sure you've heard about in some of your science classes. We're going to be talking about it a little bit later. And he's also been called the father of empiricism. Empiricism is basically that you can develop knowledge through careful observation and using inductive reasoning. So making some careful observations and trying to use what knowledge you already have to explain what you are seeing. Moving on to Rene Descartes, he really was the first one who came up with this idea of dualism. And basically what that is that there are two distinct kind of states of being, that there is mind and matter. And he was the one who famously stated, "I think, therefore I am." So psychology continued to develop over time, and we come to 1879. This is the year that most people agree was kind of the birth of modern psychology. A man named Wilhelm Wundt actually created a modern laboratory and was studying things related to psychology. It is pronounced Wundt, and you can impress a lot of people if you pronounce it correctly. He came up with this idea called structuralism. Structuralism maintains that your experiences that you're aware of can be broken down into objective sensations, so objective, sight, taste, and subjective feelings. So these are the responses emotionally to those objective sights and tastes, those things that we can measure. So we have experiences that we can measure. Think back to the behaviors that we talked about in our last video. And then we have those subjective emotional responses and mental images that are purely our own, that no one else has and are very specific to us as individuals. William James came along and he really didn't agree exactly with what Wilhelm Wundt came to believe. He was very influenced by Charles Darwin, and so he came up with this idea called functionalism. Functionalism emphasizes the purposes of behavior and mental processes. So when you think of functionalism, you can think of the function, the purpose. So he also believed that adaptive behavior patterns are learned and maintained because they are successful. So a pretty obvious one would be if you study hard and get good grades, that behavior is going to be reinforced so that you will study hard for your next test. But he also believed that any reaction, whether it's a positive reaction or a negative reaction, if it is reinforced, it will continue. The main differences between structuralism and functionalism are that structuralists break down those processes into specific elements. Functionalists are really more concerned about why the behavior exists. So, what is the purpose of it? I don't want to leave women out of psychology. So, let's go back and look at Mary Whiten Calkins. She actually studied at Harvard with William James, but due to the times, she was denied entry because she was a woman. She was actually offered a PhD from Radcliffe College, which was their sister university, but she rejected it. She basically said that if she wasn't going to get a PhD from Harvard, she didn't want one. She was still very successful. She was a prolific writer, and she was the first woman to become president of the American Psychological Association. The next woman that we're going to talk about who had a huge impact in psychology is Margaret Floy Washburn. And she is the first woman who was granted a PhD in psychology. She's the second woman to serve as the American Psychological Association president right after Mary Calkins. And she used her experimental studies in animal behavior to present her idea that mental, not just behavioral events, are legitimate and important areas for psychological study. She also wrote a lot of books, and many of her writings are still cited in psychological research today. So moving right along to behaviorism, this was a part of psychology that became very popular from the 1920s through the 1960s. And we move to John B. Watson. He is often referred to as the father of behaviorism. He defines psychology as the scientific study of observable behavior, which is very close to what we call it now. And he really built on Pavlov's salivating dog studies. So in these studies, Pavlov, who was a physician who was researching the salivation behaviors of dogs, noticed that the dogs were drooling even before they were given food. All they had to do was hear the researchers come into the room or jingle some keys. He noticed that pattern, and so he set up an experiment, and he could pretty predictably and reliably cause the dogs to start salivating before they even had the food, because the dogs associated whatever that sound was with the food. He famously conditioned a little boy named Little Albert to fear a white rat through associations with events that were scary to him. So he would make a huge sound, and startled the little boy. Eventually, the little boy started associating rats and dogs and fur coats and Santa Claus masks with things that were terrifying. And so all of those items, even if he didn't hear the terrifying sound, he would still start crying and really show a lot of terror. This is the first time that we saw this ability to generalize in a human. Continuing on with behaviorism, we have B.F. Skinner. He went by B.F. because his real name is Burris Frederick. So B.F. Skinner believed animals and humans learn to behave in certain ways because they have been reinforced for doing so. There is operant conditioning at play here. And so basically he said that we make decisions and we weigh out our options. Animals do the same thing. Is it worth it? Is the behavior that you have to do worth the reward or the reinforcement that you're going to receive? The Gestalt school basically emphasizes the tendency to see things as a big picture rather than small parts. So our brains just automatically organize things that we see, hear, believe into meaningful wholes. And so context influences our perceptions here. So on your screen, you see two pictures. They have the exact same shapes, but the first picture is just shapes. Until you put it together in a meaningful whole, we don't have any kind of understanding of what those shapes are. So finally, we get to the psychoanalytic theory from Sigmund Freud. Most of you have heard of Sigmund Freud, I'm sure. Sigmund Freud emphasized the importance of the unconscious motives, those internal conflicts in determining human behavior. He believed that negative conflicts, internal negative conflicts, would start basically bubbling up and build up a lot of pressure. And what would happen is we would let those feelings kind of slip out in ways that we really hadn't intended. So if you've ever said something and it was really close to what you meant, but it wasn't what you meant, maybe you exchanged a name for another name, it might have been a really embarrassing situation. Well, that's known as a Freudian slip. And basically, what Freud said about that is that it was our real intentions coming out. Freud also believed in dreams as being a little peek into our unconscious. And he believed that we would dream about things that represented our real feelings, often feelings that are very uncomfortable for us. A couple of things to know about Freud. Most of his less popular beliefs have been debunked, but he's really important in that he was the first one and really the only one who has developed a complete theoretical framework that explains both human development and behavior. He really was the first one to use a didactic approach to treating people with mental illnesses. He was not a psychologist, he was actually a physician. He started noticing that a lot of his patients who were women were coming in with similar complaints. And so he believed that our unconscious processes, the things that we are not aware of, are more important than the conscious experiences in governing our feelings and our behaviors. So what he would do is he would use techniques in his clinic to kind of bring that out. He used free association, which is where a client or a patient would just start talking and not really have any real path in mind, just kind of free speaking or free writing in some cases. Freud also used his own method of interpretation of dreams, and Freud believed that the things that we dream about actually have a different meaning, that they represent certain things. Usually those uncomfortable, often sexual and aggressive urges. As time moved on, people who were in alignment with Freud's beliefs started disagreeing with some of his less popular beliefs. And it sort of changed into an overall psychodynamic thinking. And basically what that means is there's a focus or an emphasis on the unconsciousness and those uncomfortable impulses, urges, and wishes very much influencing our behavior and our feelings. One last thing about Freudian slips, they can actually be pretty funny. Um, Again, it's basically an error in speech, memory, or action, and Freud believed them to be driven by unconscious beliefs or desires, but they can be pretty funny, and you can see them sometimes occur in shows, movies, and sometimes newscasts. Whew! So that's a lot of information. Before we move on, let's recap. We just covered section 2, and you should now be able to explain the historical background of the study of psychology. There are a lot of people and a lot of ideas that may be unfamiliar to you. So if you have any confusion, if you have any questions about any of the folks or terminology in this section, I really recommend that you go back and rewatch the video so that those confusions and questions are cleared up. In our next video, we are going to cover contemporary perspectives. So we will be moving out of the past and heading into where we are today and kind of the path that we're on in psychology overall. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.